A mountain man accidentally marries a fat Amish woman, and he refused to ever let her go. The courthouse bell tolls as laughter shakes the dusty street. A scarred recluse, shamed for his past, finds himself bound by law to a woman mocked for her size and her faith. She never meant to marry. He never thought he deserved love. Yet in a single stroke of a pen, both their lives are tied forever. But whispers spread fast, because this marriage may not be real at all. A preacher's fraud, a railroad's hunger for water, and a secret claim buried in her past threaten everything they're building in the mountains. As fire lights the night and gunmen close in, two outcasts must fight for more than land. They must fight for each other. Will this accidental marriage be torn apart by greed and ridicule? Or could it be the one thing heaven intended all along? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The courthouse buzzed with afternoon business as Gideon Hale shifted his weight from one dusty boot to the other. The smell of wood smoke and leather filled the cramped space where a dozen townsfolk crowded around the clerk's desk. Outside, his packhorse waited, loaded down with the season's take of beaver and marten pelts. Gideon ran calloused fingers over the scar that crossed his jaw, a habit born of discomfort around others. He'd rather face a mountain storm than deal with town affairs, but winter was coming. He needed supplies. Next, the clerk's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Across the room, Miriam Stoltzfus clutched her worn Bible to her chest, trying to make herself smaller as sideways glances took in her plain dress and prayer cap. The traveling preacher, Reverend Wallace, had promised to help her find proper lodging, but something about his too bright smile made her uneasy. "Just sign these papers, my dear," Reverend Wallace said, placing a hand on her shoulder that felt more possessive than comforting. "Simple work contract, nothing more." Miriam nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. She'd left her community behind, seeking honest work where her questioning nature wouldn't scandalize the elders. But the Reverend's hurried manner set off warning bells in her mind. "Hale!" the clerk called out. "Got your trading permits ready." At the same moment, Reverend Wallace stepped forward. "Miss Stoltzfus, right this way." In the shuffle of bodies, papers changed hands. Miriam found herself guided to the clerk's desk, a document thrust before her. Her English reading wasn't the best, but she recognized the word contract at the top. The Reverend's pen appeared in her hand. "Just here, dear," he said, tapping the bottom line. Gideon reached for what he thought was his trading permit, only to have another paper shoved at him by a harried clerk. He scrawled his name without really looking, eager to be done with town business. The clerk's stamp came down with a heavy thunk. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you—" "What?" Gideon's head snapped up. "Man and wife," the clerk finished. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Miriam's face drained of color as she realized what had happened. The document in her hands wasn't a work contract at all, but a marriage license. Reverend Wallace's smile widened as he raised his hands. "Well, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways. As an ordained minister, I'm happy to make this official." Before anyone could object, he launched into a quick blessing. Laughter erupted from the onlookers. Someone whistled. "Got yourself a wife, mountain man?" Gideon's scarred face darkened. "This ain't right," he growled. But the clerk was already moving on to the next person in line. "Papers are signed and sealed," the clerk said without looking up. "Legal. Binding in the eyes of the law." Miriam stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. She'd come west for a fresh start, not to be trapped in another arrangement she hadn't chosen. Yet when she looked at the mountain man, her husband now, according to the law, she saw the same panic in his eyes that she felt in her chest. The courthouse crowd pressed closer, their amusement at the situation growing. "Kiss the bride," someone called out, setting off another round of laughter. "Ain't kissing nobody," Gideon muttered, his hand unconsciously touching his scar again. He turned to the clerk. "There's gotta be some way to fix this." The clerk finally looked up, clearly annoyed at the disruption to his routine. "Marriage license is filed. Would take a judge to undo it, and Judge Matthews won't be back through these parts until spring thaw. Reverend Wallace clapped his hands together. Now, perhaps this is divine providence. A lonely mountain man, a widow in need of shelter. How did you know I was a widow? Miriam asked sharply, speaking for the first time since the chaos began. She hadn't told anyone in town about her past. The Reverend's smile slipped for just a moment before returning, oily as ever. Why, my dear, I simply assumed. You knew exactly what these papers were, Miriam said, her voice gaining strength. She might be plain folk, but she wasn't stupid. The Reverend had tried to trick her into something, though this outcome clearly wasn't what he'd planned. Gideon's eyes narrowed as he studied the preacher. He'd seen men like this before, smooth talkers who preyed on the vulnerable. His protective instincts, honed by years of frontier life, kicked in. Reckon you better explain yourself, Reverend, he said, taking a step forward that made the smaller man back up. No, let's not have any unpleasantness, Reverend Wallace said, tugging at his collar. Simple misunderstanding, that's all. I'm sure we can… Sheriff, the clerk's sharp voice cut through the tension. Need you in here, the crowd parted as Sheriff Miller pushed his way through, hand resting on his gun belt. What's all this ruckus? Multiple voices tried to explain at once, but Miriam's clear voice rose above them. This man, she pointed at Reverend Wallace, tried to deceive me into signing papers. I believed I was agreeing to work for lodging, not entering into marriage. The sheriff's weathered face hardened as he turned to the Reverend. That's so? Seems I recall similar complaints from other towns about a traveling preacher with a scheme. Reverend Wallace's face went pale. He backed toward the door. Simple misunderstanding, he repeated. If you'll excuse me… Think not, the sheriff said, moving to block his exit. Reckon you'll be staying in town a spell, answering some questions. As the sheriff led the protesting Reverend away, the crowd's attention turned back to the accidental newlyweds. Gideon and Miriam stood awkwardly, neither sure what to say or do next. Well, an older woman finally broke the silence. Married is married. Can't have a decent woman spending winter alone, especially not with that false preacher lurking about if he posts bail. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the courthouse. Miriam felt the weight of judgment settling around her shoulders, as heavy as her father's disapproval had been back home. She squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next with dignity. Gideon cleared his throat. Got a cabin, he said gruffly. Ain't much, but it's solid. Warm. He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. You'd be safe there, till spring at least, when the judge returns. Miriam studied him carefully. Despite his intimidating appearance, there was something honest in his eyes, a certainty that reminded her of the steady mountain peaks she'd seen on her journey west. She thought of the coming winter, of dark nights and uncertain shelter. I can cook, she offered. Keep house. I know herbs for healing, too. Don't need healing, Gideon, said automatically, then flushed slightly. But cooking would be… welcome. The courthouse crowd watched with growing approval as the practical arrangements were worked out. Someone produced paper and pen for Miriam to write a list of supplies she'd need. Another offered a sturdy coat, just till you can get your own. A third pressed a bag of coffee into Gideon's hands. For the newlyweds. As the afternoon light began to fade, Gideon led his packhorse around to the general store. While he traded his furs, Miriam gathered the basics she'd need for mountain life. Neither spoke much, both still processing the strange turn their lives had taken. Finally, as Gideon helped her mount his spare horse, Miriam found the courage to ask what had been weighing on her mind. Will you regret this kindness when the winter grows long? Gideon paused, one hand on the horse's bridle. Reckon that depends on whether you can stand living with a scarred old mountain man who ain't much for talking. A small smile touched Miriam's lips. I've lived with worse. At least you're honest about who you are. Something eased in Gideon's expression. As they rode out of town, the setting sun painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and rose. Behind them, the courthouse clock struck 5, marking the end of a day that had changed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined that morning. The townsfolk watched them go, some still chuckling at the day's events, others offering quiet prayers for the strange pair heading into the gathering dusk. Whether this accidental marriage was destiny or disaster remained to be seen, but for now, it offered shelter to a woman in need and company to a lonely man, and perhaps that was enough for a start. The courthouse erupted into chaos. Men elbowed each other, guffawing and pointing at the mismatched pair. Women whispered behind raised hands, their eyes darting between Gideon's scarred face and Miriam's plain dress that stretched tight across her ample frame. "Well, ain't this something?" a man with tobacco-stained teeth called out. "The mountain hermit finally got himself hitched to a round little church mouse." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back made clucking sounds. Miriam's face flushed deep red, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn Bible closer to her chest. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, but Gideon could see tears threatening to spill. "Quiet down now," the clerk called half-heartedly, clearly more amused than concerned. Through the commotion, Reverend Wallace edged toward the door. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy as he glanced between the crowd and the exit. Before anyone could question his role in the confusion, he slipped out into the November afternoon. "Ain't right to let this stand," declared a man in a shopkeeper's apron. "Mountain Man needs a proper frontier wife, not some foreign-speaking woman who don't know nothing about survival." He turned to the clerk. "Can't we just tear up them papers? Pretend it never happened." Several others voiced their agreement. Miriam's shoulders hunched further, making herself as small as possible. A tear finally escaped, tracking down her cheek. Gideon had stood silent through the initial shock, his scarred face unreadable. But something in him shifted at the sight of that tear. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet danger that made smart men step back. "Ain't nothing getting torn up?" he growled, moving to stand between Miriam and the crowd. "She's my wife now, proper and legal. Any man who's got something to say about it can say it to my face." The courthouse grew quiet. Everyone knew Gideon's reputation, how he'd earned those scars defending a settlement from raiders, the way he could track man or beast through the wildest country. Few wanted to challenge him directly. "Now see here," the shopkeeper tried again, but softer this time. "We're just trying to help." "Help?" Gideon's voice could have frozen water. "By mocking a woman of God? By suggesting we break the law?" He swept his gaze across the crowd. "Shame on the lot of you." The silence deepened. A few people had the grace to look embarrassed. "Ma'am," Gideon turned to Miriam, his voice gentling considerably. "Let's get out of this place." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Miriam placed her small hand in the crook of his elbow. Together they walked through the parting crowd, heads held high, though Miriam's lower lip still trembled. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. Their transportation waited where they'd left it. Gideon's 2 horses, one for riding and one packed with furs, and the wagon Miriam had hired to bring her to town. Once they were away from the courthouse steps, Miriam pulled her hand free. "Sir Mr. Hale, I never meant for any of this. I cannot be your wife. I came west for honest work, not marriage." "Where will you go?" Gideon asked simply. Miriam wrapped her arms around herself, looking small against the vast Colorado sky. I will find something. Perhaps the church. Church is locked up tight, come winter," Gideon said. "And the only priest who had a key just slithered out of town. The boarding house, then. Won't take you without proper papers or a husband's word. That's why that snake of a preacher tried his scheme." Gideon's voice roughened with anger. "He's done this before, getting women to sign papers they don't understand. Usually sells them off to mining camps, I'd wager." Miriam paled at this revelation. "I had no idea. No reason you would." Gideon softened again, seeing her distress. "Look here, I've got a cabin up in the hills. It's simple, but it's solid. Got a good roof, tight walls, extra room you can have to yourself. I cannot impose. Ain't imposing if we're married, he said practically. You'll freeze in a barn, or worse, if you stay in town. You come with me. I'll not let you starve. Miriam studied him carefully. Despite his fearsome appearance, there was something trustworthy in his steady gaze. She thought of the coming winter, of dark nights and uncertain shelter, of the preacher who had tried to trick her, and what might have happened if the papers had gone to their intended recipient. You would truly offer me shelter, expecting nothing in return? Expect you to help with cooking and such, if you've a mind to, Gideon said. But your virtue's safe with me. I give you my word. The sincerity in his voice reached something in Miriam's heart. She was tired. Tired of struggling alone. Tired of fighting against a world that seemed determined to leave her with no good choices. Perhaps this wasn't the answer she'd prayed for, but it might be the answer she needed. Very well, she said quietly. Until spring, when the judge returns. Gideon nodded, then turned to practical matters. Got any belongings to fetch? Just my trunk at the livery stable. And I should pay the wagon driver. I'll settle with him, Gideon said. You wait here. He strode off to handle the arrangements, his long legs eating up the distance. Miriam watched him go, still uncertain about everything but knowing she had no better options. The wagon driver helped transfer her trunk to Gideon's pack horse, accepting payment with a tip of his hat. Then Gideon helped Miriam up onto the wagon seat of a small cart he'd borrowed from the livery stable owner, a better option for her than riding horseback in her long skirts. The town's curious eyes followed them as Gideon led them out, him on his horse. Miriam perched stiffly on the wagon seat. She could hear the whispers, feel the stares boring into her back. Her cheeks burned again at what they must be saying. Gideon rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders set against the wind that had picked up. The late afternoon sun caught his profile, highlighting the savage scars that ran from his temple to his jaw. What sort of life awaited her with this strange, silent man? The wagon wheels creaked as they left the packed dirt of the town streets for the rougher trail that led into the hills. Behind them, Bitter Creek grew smaller, its buildings dwindling until they were barely visible against the vast landscape. Ahead, the mountains loomed, their snow-capped peaks touched with alpine glow. Miriam sat straight-backed on the hard seat, her hands folded in her lap. The jolting of the wagon matched the turmoil in her heart. Everything she'd planned, every careful step toward independence, had been upended in a single afternoon. Now, she found herself married to a stranger, heading into the wilderness as the winter darkness gathered. She whispered a prayer, asking for guidance, for strength, for some sign that she hadn't made a terrible mistake. The only answer was the wind in the prairie grass and the steady clop of hooves as they made their way toward the mountains. Gideon glanced back occasionally, checking that she was managing the wagon all right. Each time Miriam gave a small nod, determined to show she could handle whatever came. She might not have chosen this path, but she would walk it with dignity. The sun sank lower, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. Soon they would have to make camp, their first night as husband and wife. Miriam's stomach twisted at the thought, but she remembered Gideon's promise. Whatever else he might be, she sensed he was a man of his word. The wagon rattled on, carrying her toward an uncertain future in the Colorado hills. Behind them, the town gossips would be having a field day with the story the scarred mountain man and his unlikely Amish bride. But up here, with the wind whispering through the sage and the mountains standing sentinel, none of that seemed to matter quite so much. The mountain trails twisted upward through stands of pine and aspen, too narrow for anything wider than their small wagon. Miriam gripped the wooden seat as the wheels jolted over rocks and ruts. The borrowed cart creaked ominously with each bump. Gideon rode ahead on his horse, occasionally dismounting to check the path or clear fallen branches. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered over the peaks. The wind carried the sharp scent of coming snow. Gideon pulled his mount to a halt and waited for Miriam's wagon to catch up. "We'll need to make camp soon," he said, gesturing to a protected hollow beside a spring-fed stream. "Storm's coming in. Best to settle before dark." Miriam nodded, her arms aching from controlling the wagon. She watched as Gideon efficiently set up camp, unloading only what they needed for the night. His movements were precise, Practice the routine of a man long used to caring for himself in the wilderness. I can help with the cooking, she offered, wanting to be useful. Gideon paused in arranging stones for a fire ring. Much obliged. Supplies are in that saddlebag there. Miriam opened the leather bag, finding unfamiliar items: dried meat, hard biscuits, coffee beans, and a small sack of cornmeal. Her fingers hesitated over the strange provisions. Back home, she'd had a proper kitchen with familiar ingredients: flour for bread, fresh vegetables from the garden, preserves put up for winter. Is something wrong? Gideon asked, noting her uncertainty. These are different from what I'm used to cooking with, she admitted. In my community, we had proper hearths and cooking pots. A ghost of a smile crossed Gideon's scarred face. He reached for his pack and pulled out a battered tin pot and an iron skillet. Here, he said, we can make cornmeal mush in the pot. Fry up some salt pork in the skillet. Simple fare, but it fills the belly. Together they prepared the meal, Gideon quietly demonstrating how to balance the pot over the fire, how much water to add to the cornmeal. He didn't mock her inexperience, for which Miriam was grateful. As they ate from tin plates, the first snowflakes began to fall. Miriam pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken questions. May I ask, she ventured finally, how long you've lived in these mountains? Gideon poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying. 10 years, give or take. Mostly alone, except for trading trips to town. That's a long time to be solitary, he shrugged. Suited me well enough. Miriam studied her plate, gathering courage. I understand being alone. After my husband Daniel died, she paused, the grief still fresh. It was fever that took him, back in Ohio. We'd been married just 2 years. Gideon's expression softened slightly. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Miriam twisted her hands in her lap. Afterward, when I suggested leaving to find work, my family didn't understand. They said I was turning my back on our ways. In the end, they disowned me. That's a heavy burden to carry, Gideon said quietly. Yes. Miriam blinked back tears. But I couldn't stay, watching everyone's pity, being reminded daily of what I'd lost. Gideon nodded, saying nothing more. But something in his posture had changed, as if her words had touched some answering pain in his own heart. They slept that night with the fire between them, Miriam wrapped in thick blankets Gideon had provided, he in his familiar bedroll. The snow fell steadily, but their small camp remained snug under the sheltering pines. Morning brought clearer skies and a world transformed by white. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and hard biscuits before breaking camp. The day's journey was slower, the wagon wheels now having to break through fresh snow. By late afternoon on the second day, they crested a ridge. Miriam caught her breath at the view a small valley spread below them, protected by rising cliffs. In a clearing stood a cabin, its log walls weathered gray by sun and storm. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, curling lazily in the still air. Someone's there, Miriam said, alarmed. Just the banked fire I left, Gideon explained. Keeps the cabin from freezing while I'm gone. He led them down a switchback trail to the cabin's door. The building was sturdy but plain, with a small stable attached to one side. A stack of split wood lined the north wall, and a rough garden patch now covered in snow spread behind. Gideon helped Miriam down from the wagon, then began efficiently unloading their supplies and the furs he'd taken to trade. Miriam stood uncertainly, stamping her feet to warm them, until he gestured for her to go inside. The cabin's interior was dim after the snow-bright day. As her eyes adjusted, Miriam took in the sparse furnishings. 2 rough-built bunks against opposite walls, a table made from a split log, a few chairs. The fireplace dominated one end, its stone chimney drawing well. An iron pot hung from a swing arm, and various cooking implements hung from pegs nearby. Everything was functional, but bare. No curtains softened the small windows. No rugs covered the packed earth floor. The only decorative touch was a carved wooden cross hanging beside the door. Gideon ducked inside, carrying her trunk. "It's not much," he said gruffly, setting it down. "But it's solid, keeps out wind and weather." Miriam turned slowly, taking in the bachelor simplicity of the space. Despite its starkness, she could see the care that had gone into its construction: the well-fitted logs, the smooth plastered chimney, the tight-shuttered windows. "This place needs a woman's hand," she said finally, already making mental notes. "A proper hearth brush here, some shelving there, perhaps a curtain to divide the sleeping areas." Gideon paused in the doorway, another load of supplies in his arms. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or hope. But he only nodded and continued with his work, leaving Miriam to begin organizing what would now be their shared home. Outside, the sun slipped behind the mountains. Inside, Miriam hung her shawl on a peg and rolled up her sleeves. Whatever else this strange marriage might bring, she could at least make this cabin into a proper home. It was a start. The afternoon light was fading when Gideon finally finished bringing in their supplies. Miriam stood in the cabin's center, her black bonnet still tied firmly under her chin, unsure where to begin. The cabin's single room suddenly felt very small with both of them in it. Gideon cleared his throat. "Your trunk can go there," he said, pointing to a space beside the larger bed. "That'll be your sleeping place. The bed's sturdy enough, made it myself from pine logs." Miriam nodded, grateful for his matter-of-fact tone. The bed looked solid, if plain, with a straw-stuffed mattress and several woolen blankets folded at its foot. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then, needing to keep her hands busy, she asked, "Do you have a broom?" Gideon retrieved a rough-made broom from behind the door. Miriam grasped it gratefully, familiar work helping to settle her nerves. The packed earth floor was scattered with pine needles and wood chips. She began sweeping methodically, the repetitive motion soothing. "I'll get more firewood," Gideon said, clearly relieved to have an excuse to step outside. Through the window, Miriam watched him swing his axe in long, practiced strokes. The sharp crack of splitting wood echoed off the valley walls. The cabin's interior slowly took shape under her attention. She arranged her few belongings in the trunk, hung her spare dress on a peg, and organized the scattered cooking implements near the hearth. A bucket of fresh water from the spring gave her the means to scrub the table's surface and wipe down the window's single pane. When she went to bring in wood herself, Gideon paused in his chopping. "No need," he started to say. But Miriam was already gathering an armload of split logs. "I'm stronger than I look," she said, managing a small smile. "We Amish women aren't afraid of work." Something like respect flickered in Gideon's eyes as she carried the wood inside. He returned to his chopping with renewed vigor. As dusk approached, bringing with it a deeper chill, Gideon came in and stirred up the fire. He lifted a covered pot from where it sat, keeping warm at the hearth's edge. "Made beans this morning before I left," he explained, somewhat apologetically. "And there's cornbread from yesterday." "It smells good," Miriam said honestly. Her stomach growled, reminding her they'd eaten little since morning. They sat at opposite ends of the table, the lantern between them casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The beans were plain but filling, seasoned with salt pork and pepper. The cornbread was dense but not burned. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about this strange situation they found themselves in. After the meal, Miriam insisted on washing the few dishes while Gideon brought in a final armload of wood for the night. She could hear him moving about, setting up a narrow cot near the hearth. "You don't have to," she began. "I'll sleep here," he said firmly but not unkindly. "It's proper." Miriam felt her cheeks warm, grateful for his consideration. She finished the dishes and turned down her bed, changing quickly into her nightclothes behind a blanket she'd hung temporarily for privacy. The cabin grew quiet, except for the pop and crackle of the fire. Miriam lay in her bed, listening to Gideon's steady breathing from his cot. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was slow in coming. Everything felt strange. The mountain silence, the unfamiliar bed, the presence of a man she barely knew yet was somehow married to. Morning came early, gray light seeping through the window's dusty pane. Miriam woke to find Gideon already up and dressed, checking his rifle by the door. "Going to check my trap lines," he said, seeing she was awake. "Might be gone most of the morning. There's coffee in the pot if you want it." Miriam sat up, smoothing her hair under her cap. "I saw flour in the supplies yesterday. I could try baking bread while you're gone." Gideon nodded. "Do as you please. Wood stacked by the hearth if you need more." After he left, Miriam set about making the cabin's first proper bread. The fire needed coaxing, and the Dutch oven was different from her familiar bread pans back home. Her first attempt at judging the heat went badly. The bottom burned while the top stayed doughy. "Lord, grant me patience," she muttered, scraping out the ruined loaf. But she was nothing if not determined. Her second attempt went better, though the crust was still darker than she'd like. While the third loaf baked, she examined the window's bare frame. The morning light was harsh, making the cabin's interior feel exposed. Taking out her sewing kit, she studied one of her spare aprons, simple cotton, but clean and sturdy. With careful cuts and quick stitches, she fashioned a simple curtain. The morning passed in domestic routine that felt both familiar and strange. She swept again, organized the pantry supplies, and finally produced a loaf of bread she felt satisfied with. The cabin slowly began to feel less like a bachelor's shelter and more like a proper home. The curtain was hung, and the fresh bread cooling when Gideon returned, stamping snow from his boots. He paused in the doorway, taking in the changes. His eyes went from the curtained window to the neat stack of wood by the hearth, then to the bread on the table. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes, though his face remained serious. "Smells good," he said simply, but Miriam heard the appreciation in his voice. That evening, after their shared meal, Miriam knelt beside her bed, as she always did for prayers. The rough floorboards were hard under her knees, but she barely noticed. Her heart was too full of questions. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand your plan in this. A marriage certificate signed by mistake, a stranger's cabin for my home." She paused, remembering Gideon's quiet courtesy, his respect for her privacy, his appreciation of her efforts today. "But perhaps this is your way of providing for both of us. Grant me wisdom to see your path clearly." From his cot by the fire, Gideon watched through half-closed eyes as Miriam prayed. The curtain she'd made shifted gently in the draft, softening the room's hard edges. The lingering smell of fresh bread filled the air. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth he wasn't ready to name. He turned his face to the fire, but the feeling remained. For the first time in 10 years, his cabin felt like more than just shelter from the elements. It felt like it might become a home. A week of snowfall transformed the mountain landscape around Gideon's cabin. White drifts piled against the rough-hewn logs, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves. Inside, warmth and routine began to shape their shared life. Each morning, Gideon rose before dawn to check his trap lines, his boots crunching through fresh snow. Miriam woke to tend the fire and start breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or flatbread with dried apple preserves she'd found stored in the root cellar. When Gideon returned, they shared the morning meal in what had become a comfortable silence. During the days, Gideon split wood until the pile beside the cabin grew impressive. The steady rhythm of his axe became familiar background music to Miriam's indoor tasks. She'd taken to mending his clothes, clucking her tongue at the crude repairs he'd attempted himself. "These stitches look like they were done by a bear," she muttered one afternoon, unpicking a poorly patched sleeve. Gideon glanced up from where he was cleaning his rifle. "Bears ain't known for their needlework," he said dryly, and Miriam found herself smiling at his unexpected humor. The cabin slowly transformed under her care. Floors swept daily now gleamed smooth as honey. Tin plates and iron pots hung in orderly rows near the hearth. She'd even managed to fashion crude soap from rendered fat and wood ash, filling the cabin with the sharp, clean scent of lye. Their days fell into comfortable patterns. While Gideon worked outside, Miriam kept busy with endless domestic tasks, cooking, cleaning, organizing their meager supplies. She discovered Gideon was actually a fair cook himself, though his meals tended toward the simple and hearty. Still, he seemed to appreciate her touch in the kitchen, especially her bread making, which improved with each attempt. One particularly cold afternoon, as Miriam stirred a pot of bean soup, the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the quiet. Gideon stepped inside, rifle ready, and peered through the curtained window. "Rider coming," he said tersely. "Stay inside." Miriam's heart quickened. Visitors were rare this high in the mountains, especially in winter. Through the window, she watched a horse and rider materialize from the swirling snow. "It's Deputy Clay," Gideon announced, recognizing the man from Bitter Creek. He set his rifle aside but didn't fully relax. The deputy dismounted stiffly, leading his horse into the shelter of a lean-to. Snow dusted his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat. When he reached the cabin door, he knocked politely despite his obvious discomfort from the cold. "Come in, deputy," Gideon said, opening the door. "You're a long ride from town." Clay stamped snow from his boots and nodded gratefully at Miriam's gesture toward the fire. "Much obliged, Mrs. Hale. It's bitter out there." Miriam noticed how he hesitated slightly over her name. Something in his manner suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Can I offer you coffee, deputy?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Thank you, ma'am." "That would be welcome." Clay settled on a bench near the fire, but his posture remained tense. He accepted the steaming cup with another nod of thanks. After a moment of awkward silence, the deputy cleared his throat. "I'm afraid I've come with some concerning news." Gideon remained standing, his face unreadable. "What kind of news?" "It's about that preacher who performed your marriage ceremony." Clay took a careful sip of coffee. "Turns out he wasn't what he claimed to be. Man's wanted in 3 territories for fraud, and worse." Miriam felt her knees weaken. She sank onto a chair, her hands clutching her apron. "What does that mean? For us?" The deputy looked uncomfortable. "Well, ma'am, it casts some doubt on the legitimacy of the marriage. The license itself is properly filed, but without a recognized authority to perform the ceremony." He trailed off, then added, "The circuit judge will be through Bitter Creek in January. You could petition him to validate the marriage then, if you chose." "So even this accident isn't real?" Miriam's voice was barely above a whisper. All the careful routine they'd built over the past week suddenly felt as fragile as frost on a window pane. Gideon had been standing silent, his face shadowed. Now he stepped forward, his voice rough but determined. "I'll make it real if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them. Miriam's breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't find words to respond. Her mind whirled with confusion, the humiliation of their accidental binding, the comfort she'd found in their shared days, the quiet strength of Gideon's presence. Deputy Clay cleared his throat again. "Well, you have until January to decide. Judge Thompson's fair-minded. He'll consider your situation carefully." He set down his empty cup and stood. "I should head back before the snow gets worse." Gideon walked the deputy out to his horse. Miriam stayed by the fire, her thoughts churning like the snow outside. Through the window, she watched the 2 men talk briefly. Then Clay mounted and rode away, his figure quickly swallowed by the wet, swirling white. When Gideon returned, he didn't speak of his offer. Instead, he settled on his bench and pulled out his hunting knife, beginning the familiar routine of sharpening it against a whetstone. The steady scraping sound filled the cabin. Miriam busied herself with supper preparations, but her hands moved automatically while her mind worked over their situation. The marriage had begun as a mistake, a cruel joke of circumstance. Yet in just a week, she'd found something here she hadn't expected, not just shelter from the winter, but a sense of purpose. Gideon was gruff but unfailingly kind, respectful of her ways, appreciative of her efforts to make his cabin a home. As darkness gathered outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin's corners like a hungry wolf. Miriam found herself humming softly as she worked an old hymn her mother used to sing. The familiar tune steadied her, a reminder of faith guiding her path even when she couldn't see clearly ahead. "That's pretty," Gideon said quietly, surprising her. It was the first thing he'd said since the deputy left. Miriam's humming faltered for a moment, then continued. The knife's scraping rhythm joined her tune, and somehow, the two sounds wove together comfortably. The cabin felt warmer somehow, less lonely than it had even that morning. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, in the glow of firelight, two people who'd been brought together by accident found themselves choosing, moment by moment, to build something real from that chance beginning. The evening passed quietly. They shared a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread, each lost in their own thoughts. But when Miriam knelt for her evening prayers, she felt a new peace settling over her. God's hand was in this, she thought. Perhaps not in the fraudulent preacher or the mistaken papers, but in bringing her to this place, to this man who offered shelter without demands and protection without constraints. Gideon's words echoed in her mind. I'll make it real if you'll have me. Not a romantic declaration, but something deeper, a choice, freely offered. As she rose from her prayers, she glanced at him, still sitting by the fire. His knife was still now, his eyes focused on the flames as if searching for answers there. The wind's howl rose to a shriek, then subsided to a mournful moan. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, and two people who'd begun as strangers found themselves less alone than they'd been before. A week after Deputy Clay's unsettling visit, frost painted delicate patterns across the cabin's window panes. Gideon rose early, as always, but today he had different plans than his usual trapline rounds. He needed to check the spring that fed his homestead, and after watching Miriam's determined efforts to learn mountain ways, he decided to include her in this vital task. Ever worn snowshoes? He asked over breakfast. Miriam looked up from her porridge, surprise clear on her face. No, can't say that I have. Time you learned. Need to check the spring today. He paused, studying her reaction. If you're willing. Of course. Miriam's eyes brightened with interest, though I might not be very graceful at it. Gideon's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Nobody is first time. After breakfast, he brought out 2 pairs of snowshoes, one his own, the other a spare set he'd traded for years ago. The wooden frames were well maintained, the rawhide webbing still strong. He showed Miriam how to secure them to her boots, then demonstrated the wide-stepped walking motion needed to keep from tangling the shoes. Miriam's first attempts were awkward, as expected. She wobbled and stumbled, her skirts hampering her movement until she hitched them up slightly, securing them with twine around her knees. Gideon pretended not to notice her flushed cheeks, or the way she muttered under her breath in Pennsylvania Dutch when she fell. You're doing fine, he assured her, offering his arm for balance. Just remember to lift your feet clear each step. They set out across the snow-covered clearing, Miriam gradually finding her rhythm. The morning air was crisp and clean, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the winter sunshine. Fresh powder squeaked beneath their snowshoes, and overhead, pine boughs swayed gently in the breeze. The spring's about half a mile up, Gideon explained as they walked. It's what makes this place possible. Without it, nothing could survive here long term. Miriam nodded, concentrating on her steps but clearly listening. God's provision, she said simply. The trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen. Gideon kept a steady pace but watched Miriam carefully, ready to slow if she tired. To his surprise, she maintained the pace well, her natural strength serving her despite her unfamiliarity with snowshoes. When they reached the spring, Miriam caught her breath in wonder. Even in winter, the water bubbled up clear and strong from the ground, cutting a narrow channel through the snow. Steam rose faintly from the surface where the spring first emerged, evidence of its underground warmth. It never freezes, Gideon explained, pride evident in his voice. Flows year-round, no matter how cold it gets. Waters my garden patch in summer, keeps the stock alive, feeds the creek that runs past the cabin. It's beautiful, Miriam said softly, watching the play of sunlight on the moving water. Gideon nodded toward a weathered post near the stream's edge. That's my claim marker. Makes it legal, though nobody's challenged it yet. Too far up in the mountains for most folks' taste. Miriam walked carefully closer to the post, squinting at the faded markings carved into the wood. Suddenly, she went very still. "Gideon," she said slowly. "There's another name here, faint, but—" She traced the barely visible letters with her mittened hand. "Jacob Stoltzfus, my late husband." Gideon frowned, moving to look where she pointed. Sure enough, beneath his own claim marks, he could make out the older carving. "Might be coincidence," he said, but Miriam was shaking her head. "Jacob bought a claim out here, before we married. Said it was an investment, though nothing ever came of it. He never even saw the land himself." Her voice held a mix of wonder and uncertainty. "I never knew where exactly it was, but—" Gideon shrugged, uncomfortable with the possibility. Whatever claim he had would have lapsed years ago, with no improvements made. "Yes, of course," Miriam said quickly. "I'm not suggesting. I just think it's strange how things work out sometimes." She stared at the post a moment longer, then added quietly, "I'd like to remember this, though. Something about it feels important." They made their way back to the cabin in thoughtful silence, each wrapped in their own contemplations. The return journey was easier, their tracks from the morning showing clear in the snow. Miriam had mastered the snowshoes enough to move with reasonable confidence, though she still accepted Gideon's steadying hand on the steeper sections. Back at the cabin, they settled into their afternoon tasks. Miriam had been saving tallow from their meat, determined to try her hand at candle making. She worked carefully at the table, melting the fat and preparing the wicks while Gideon tackled a broken door hinge that had been squeaking badly in the cold. The familiar sounds of their work filled the cabin, the scrape of Gideon's tools, the soft splashing as Miriam dipped the wicks, the crackle of the fire keeping them warm. Outside, the short winter day was already fading toward dusk. "These aren't as straight as I'd like," Miriam commented, examining her first attempts at candles. "But they'll burn well enough, I think." Gideon looked up from his repair work. "Better than pine knots for light. Smell better, too." "That's not saying much," Miriam replied, her tone dry. "Everything smells better than pine knots." The unexpectedness of her humor caught Gideon off guard, and he snorted in agreement. Miriam glanced at him, her eyes twinkling, and suddenly she was laughing, really laughing, the sound rich and warm and free. It filled the cabin, bouncing off the rough-hewn rafters, transforming the simple space with its joy. Gideon found himself frozen in place, struck by how completely her laughter changed everything. It chased away shadows he hadn't even realized were there. Shadows that had lived in his heart so long he'd stopped noticing their weight. The sound of her happiness rang true as a bell, and something deep inside him responded to it, warming places long gone cold. He watched her, this woman who had arrived by accident, and was slowly, steadily making his bare cabin into a home. Her face was lit with amusement, her hands still covered in tallow, her hair escaping its pins in wisps around her face. She was nothing like what he would have chosen, had anyone asked him to choose a wife. Yet here she was, filling his days with purpose and his nights with the comfort of another breathing soul nearby. As her laughter subsided into chuckles, Miriam wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "Oh my, I haven't laughed like that in so long. I'd almost forgotten how it feels." Gideon nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He returned to his work on the hinge, but the warmth of that moment stayed with him, like sunlight lingering on the skin after a cloud passes. They finished their tasks as evening settled in fully outside. Miriam's new candles, despite their slightly crooked shapes, cast a gentle light as they shared a simple supper. The fixed hinge swung smooth and silent when Gideon tested it one final time. Small achievements, perhaps, but they represented something larger, the slow transformation of survival into living, of shelter into home. And if Gideon found his eyes drawn more often to Miriam's face in the candlelight, or if Miriam's hands lingered when, passing him his coffee cup, neither of them mentioned it. The memory of her laughter stayed with him, even as they prepared for sleep in their now familiar routine. It had changed something in him, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Like the spring they'd visited that morning, it had broken through a frozen place, starting a flow that might, in time, bring new life to long barren ground. December brought deeper snows and shorter days to the mountain cabin. The sun barely cleared the peaks before sinking again, leaving long hours of lamplight and fireshine. But inside, warmth bloomed as Christmas drew near, carried on the scent of Miriam's baking and the fresh pine boughs she insisted on gathering. "Christmas should feel like Christmas," she declared one morning, kneading dough at the rough-hewn table. Even here in the wilderness. Gideon looked up from where he sat mending a broken trap. "Never much bothered with it before," he admitted. But watching her work the dough with strong, capable hands, he found himself unwilling to discourage her enthusiasm. "Well, we'll bother with it now," Miriam said firmly. "The Lord's birth deserves celebrating, whether in a fine church or a mountain cabin." Her fingers deftly shaped the dough into rolls, setting them to rise near the hearth. While the bread rose, she ventured outside with Gideon to gather pine branches. The fresh snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked the edge of the clearing. Miriam pointed out the healthiest boughs, and Gideon cut them with swift strokes of his knife. "These will make fine garlands," Miriam said, gathering the branches in her arms. The sharp scent of pine sap filled the air, mingling with her breath in the cold. "Though I wish I had some red ribbon to weave through them. Might have something that'll do," Gideon said. Back at the cabin, he dug through his stores and produced a length of faded red cloth, left over from making signal flags in his scouting days. Miriam's face lit up. "Perfect! The color's still bright enough to show against the green." She tore the cloth into strips and began weaving them through the pine boughs she'd arranged on the table. While she worked on the garlands, Gideon disappeared into the lean-to where he kept his tools. He'd been working on something in secret for days, using the hours when Miriam was busy with her baking and mending. The pine logs he'd selected were finally taking shape under his knife and saw. Inside, Miriam hung the finished garlands along the cabin's main beam and around the window frame. The simple decorations transformed the space, bringing Christmas cheer to the weathered walls. The smell of baking bread filled the air as she pulled golden brown rolls from the Dutch oven. "Henry's coming for supper tomorrow," Gideon announced as evening fell. "Thought we might share some of that Christmas baking with him." Miriam nodded, pleased. "I'll make extra rolls. Will he mind celebrating a Christian holiday?" "Henry respects all honest faith," Gideon said. "Known him long enough to be sure of that." The next day, as the sun began its early descent, hoofbeats approached the cabin. Henry arrived, bundled against the cold, his horse's breath steaming in the winter air. Gideon went out to help him stable the animal, while Miriam added another log to the fire and checked her bread. When the men entered, Henry removed his hat and bowed slightly to Miriam. "The cabin smells like summer meadows," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "Sweet as bee flower." Miriam flushed at the compliment. "Thank you. Please, sit and warm yourself. The rolls are just ready." They gathered around the table, lamplight gleaming on tin plates and cups. Henry took a bite of the fresh bread and closed his eyes in appreciation. "Good as any I've tasted," he said. "Better than most." The conversation flowed easily as they ate, warmed by food and fire. Henry spoke of conditions in the lower valleys, of deer movements and weather, signs. But as the meal went on, talk turned to deeper matters. "Didn't expect to find Gideon with a wife," Henry said, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Not after what we saw in the territorial fights." Miriam glanced at Gideon, who had gone still at Henry's words. "You fought together?" she asked softly. Henry nodded. "Side by side. Gideon was scout, same as me. Good man in bad times." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Too much death in those days. Good men on all sides. Killing each other over lines on paper maps. That's why I left," Gideon said roughly. It was the most he'd ever spoken of his past. Couldn't stomach more of it. Came up here where the only fights are with weather and wildlife. Miriam saw the shadow in his eyes and understood better now, his choice of solitude. Her heart ached for the younger man he'd been, witnessing such violence. Henry studied them both. Maybe the mountains knew what they were doing, bringing you two together. He smiled slightly. Even accidents can be medicine for old wounds. After Henry left, the snow began falling heavily, thick flakes swirling in the darkness beyond the window. Gideon stoked the fire, then disappeared briefly into the lean-to. He returned, carrying something large wrapped in a blanket. "Made you something," he said gruffly, setting it down. "For Christmas. Might as well give it now." Miriam pulled back the blanket and gasped softly. A rocking chair stood revealed, crafted from smooth pine logs. The joints were carefully fitted, the seat and back curved for comfort, the rockers perfectly balanced. "Oh, Gideon," she breathed. Her fingers traced the polished wood, feeling the care in every detail. "Thought you might like somewhere proper to sit while you mend or read your Bible," he said, watching her face. "Better than those hard, straight chairs." Miriam sat in the rocker, testing its gentle motion. Tears pricked her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. This man, who claimed to care nothing for Christmas, had spent hours crafting comfort for her. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's beautiful." Gideon shifted awkwardly, then spoke as if the words were difficult to form. "Like having you here," he said. "Makes the place feel different, better." Color rose in Miriam's cheeks. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, but a smile curved her lips. Silently, she offered thanks to God for bringing her to this unexpected place, this surprising man. The snow continued falling outside, building drifts around the cabin walls. But inside, warmth bloomed between two hearts learning to trust in hope again. The pine garlands cast subtle shadows in the lamplight, and the fresh roll's homey scent lingered in the air. Tomorrow would bring Christmas proper, but already the season's true gifts were unfolding. Peace, acceptance, and the tender beginnings of love. The morning after Christmas dawned bitter cold. Frost patterns decorated the cabin's small window panes like delicate lace. Inside, Miriam hummed as she swept pine needles from the floor, still content from yesterday's celebrations. Gideon had gone to check his trap lines at first light, leaving her to tend the fire and start the day's baking. The sound of approaching horses made her pause. Through the frosted glass, she saw 3 riders approaching through the snow-laden pines. Their dark silhouettes seemed ominous against the white landscape. Miriam's heart quickened. Visitors were rare this high in the mountains, especially in winter. The riders reined up in front of the cabin. Their horses' breath steamed in the frigid air as the men dismounted. The leader was well dressed in a fine wool coat and polished boots that seemed out of place in the wilderness. His companions wore gun belts and carried rifles. A sharp knock rattled the door. Miriam smoothed her apron and opened it, letting in a blast of cold air. "Good morning, ma'am," the well-dressed man said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm Theodore Barstow, agent for the Western Pacific Railroad Company." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he looked past her into the cabin. "I need to speak with Gideon Hale." "He's checking his trap lines," Miriam answered. "He should return soon if you'd like to wait." Barstow's lips tightened. "We'll wait inside if you don't mind. It's rather cold out here." Without waiting for her response, he stepped past her into the cabin, his men following. Miriam's hands clenched in her apron as the strangers invaded the peaceful space. She could feel their eyes taking in everything. The Christmas garlands, her rocking chair, the bread dough rising by the fire. "Well, well," Barstow said, running a gloved finger along the table's rough surface. "Hale's been domesticating his den, I see, though I hadn't heard he'd taken a wife." His gaze swept over Miriam's plain dress and full figure with barely concealed contempt. "Would you like some coffee while you wait?" Miriam offered, trying to maintain her dignity despite his obvious disdain. "No, thank you," Barstow replied coldly. His men positioned themselves near the door, hands never far from their weapons. The tension in the cabin grew thick as molasses as they waited. Miriam tried to continue her work, but she could feel Barstow's calculating stare following her every move. Relief flooded through her when she finally heard Gideon's familiar tread on the porch. Gideon filled the doorway, his broad shoulders dusted with snow. His expression darkened as he took in the scene before him. "What's this about?" he demanded, moving to stand protectively near Miriam. Barstow's smile turned predatory. "Mr. Hale, I've come about the spring that feeds this property." He reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of papers. The railroad is claiming water rights to all sources in this watershed. We'll be needing you to vacate the premises before the spring thaw. Like hell, Gideon growled. That spring's been part of my homestead claim for 10 years. Ah, but did you ever properly file the water rights? Barstow's voice dripped with false concern. Our surveyors have determined this watershed is essential for our planned route through the pass. The company's needs must take precedence over individual squatters. Miriam saw Gideon's hands curl into fists. She touched his arm gently, warning him to stay calm. The armed men watched every movement, waiting for an excuse. You can't just steal a man's water, Gideon said, his voice rough with anger. Barstow shrugged. The law says otherwise. I'll return in a week with the official papers. I suggest you start packing. He placed his hat back on his head with a flourish. Though I can't imagine what possessed you to bring a woman up here in the first place. The company will be doing her a favor, really. Get out, Gideon snarled, taking a step forward. The armed men raised their rifles slightly, but Barstow waved them down. No need for unpleasantness. We're leaving. He paused at the door. 1 week, Hale. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The moment they left, Gideon slammed his fist against the wall. Thieves and cutthroats with fancy papers, he spat. They won't take my land. I'll die before I let them. Gideon, wait, Miriam said urgently. Something was tugging at her memory. The spring marker she'd seen. Her husband's name. My trunk. Help me check my trunk. What? The papers from my first husband. There might be something about water rights. I remember him buying claims out here before he died. Hope flickered across Gideon's scarred face. Together they knelt beside Miriam's trunk, carefully removing her neatly folded belongings. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, they found a packet of documents. Miriam's hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle papers. Here, she exclaimed. Look, Jacob bought water rights to 3 springs in these mountains. The descriptions. One of them matches yours. Gideon took the paper reverently, studying the faded writing. These are proper deeds, filed with the territorial office. He looked at Miriam with wonder. You might have just saved everything. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Miriam said softly. Perhaps this is why he brought me here. As evening settled over the mountain, they sat close together by the fire, examining the documents and planning their next moves. The lamplight cast their shadows on the wall, no longer 2 separate figures, but joined in common purpose. We'll need to go to town, Gideon said, running a hand through his hair. File these papers properly. Make sure everything's legal before Barstow comes back. Miriam nodded, her face serious in the flickering light. We'll fight them together, she said firmly. This is our home now. Gideon's rough hand found hers, squeezing gently. The fire crackled and popped, throwing sparks up the chimney into the cold night sky. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside the cabin, hope burned bright and steady as a winter star. January arrived with teeth of ice and howling winds that rattled the cabin's sturdy logs. The new year brought storms that piled snow in deep drifts against the walls, transforming the mountain landscape into endless waves of white. Inside the cabin, Gideon and Miriam fell into the familiar rhythms that marked their unexpected life together. Each morning before dawn, Gideon trudged through knee-deep snow to check the spring. The precious water source needed constant attention to keep it from freezing solid. He'd break the surface ice and clear fallen branches, knowing their survival depended on keeping that water flowing. Miriam would watch from the doorway, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, until he returned with frost coating his beard. You shouldn't stand there with the door open, he'd grumble, stamping snow from his boots. Wastes heat. But Miriam would just smile and hand him a steaming cup of coffee. The Lord watches over his children, she'd say, but I reckon he doesn't mind if I help keep an eye on you too. Their days filled with the endless tasks of mountain survival. Miriam learned to bank the fire, just right to keep it burning through the night. Gideon showed her how to stack wood against the walls, to create an extra barrier against the cold. Together they worked to keep their small world turning despite nature's fury. The storm that trapped them inside came roaring down from the peaks without warning. One moment the sky was gray and brooding. The next, a wall of white obscured everything beyond the cabin's windows. The wind screamed like a wild thing, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. "Might be 3-4 days before this breaks," Gideon said, peering out at the whiteout conditions. "Good thing we stocked up on supplies." Miriam nodded, already mentally cataloging their stores of food and fuel. The pantry shelves held her preserved vegetables and dried meat, enough to last weeks if they were careful. Still, being trapped inside brought its own challenges. By the second day, they'd settled into a peculiar kind of peace. With no outside tasks possible, Gideon brought out his collection of damaged trap lines that needed mending. He sat at the table, his big hands working surprisingly delicately with the wire and tools. "Would you like to learn?" he asked, noticing Miriam's interest. "Always good to know how, out here." Miriam pulled her chair closer, and Gideon began teaching her the intricate work of repair. His voice grew animated as he explained each step, showing her how to splice wire and test the mechanism's action. She was a quick study, her fingers nimble from years of detailed needlework. "You've got a knack for it," he said approvingly as she completed her first repair. The praise brought color to her cheeks. To pass the endless hours, Miriam began teaching Gideon the hymns she'd grown up singing. The German words felt strange on his tongue, but he tried gamely, his deep voice stumbling over the unfamiliar syllables. "Großer Gott, or Lobendish," Miriam sang slowly, then waited for him to repeat, "Großer Gott." Gideon managed, before shaking his head with a rueful laugh. "My tongue wasn't made for such fancy words." Miriam's own laughter joined his, filling the cabin with warmth despite the storm's fury outside. "The Lord appreciates the effort," she assured him, her eyes twinkling. "Even if the pronunciation needs work." On the third day, cabin fever began to set in. That exhausted their usual tasks, and the constant howl of wind wore at their nerves. Gideon paced like a caged bear, while Miriam kneaded bread dough with more force than necessary. "Tell me about your people," Gideon said suddenly, surprising them both. He'd rarely asked about her past before. Miriam's hands stilled in the dough. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Anything." He settled into his chair. "How you lived, what you believed, why they let you go." So Miriam told him, her voice soft but steady, about the ordered world she'd left behind. She spoke of community barn raisings and shared meals, of strict rules and stricter elders. She explained how questioning those rules had led to her exile, how even grief for her dead husband had to be expressed in approved ways. "Sometimes I miss it terribly," she admitted. "The sense of belonging, of knowing your place in God's plan. Other times," she glanced around the cabin, at the curtains she'd hung and the quilts she'd made. "Other times I think perhaps he had a different plan for me all along." Gideon listened intently, asking occasional questions, but mostly letting her words fill the space between them. When she finished, silence fell, broken only by the crackling fire and the muted storm. The next morning, they woke to sudden quiet. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world transformed. Sunshine sparkled off snow so deep it reached the windowsills. The sky arched overhead in impossible blue, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves. They spent the day digging out, creating paths to the woodpile and spring. The work was hard but necessary, and they fell into an easy rhythm working side by side. As afternoon faded toward evening, they returned inside, tired but satisfied with their progress. Miriam prepared a simple supper while Gideon built up the fire. The familiar domestic scene struck her suddenly with its precariousness. Soon they would have to ride down to town to face the circuit judge about their accidental marriage. The thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. What if Gideon only wanted to maintain their marriage because of her husband's water rights? The question had haunted her through the storm days, despite their growing closeness. She was no fool. She knew she wasn't the kind of wife most men would choose. Plain, plump, past her prime. Perhaps convenience was all she could hope for. Lost in these thoughts, she barely noticed when Gideon spoke her name. She looked up to find him watching her across the fire, his scarred face serious in the flickering light. "I'm no good with words, Miriam," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "but I've come to need you." The simple declaration hit her like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision of his beloved face. This was no calculation of convenience, no cold bargain about land and water rights. This was a man's heart, laid bare in the only way he knew how. "Oh," she whispered, one hand pressed to her mouth. A tear spilled down her cheek. Gideon shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to handle her emotion. "Don't cry," he said gruffly. "I didn't mean to upset you." Miriam gave a watery laugh. "These are happy tears, you dear man." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "I've come to need you, too." The tension in his shoulders eased, and something like wonder crossed his face. They sat in companionable silence as darkness gathered outside, each marveling at how thoroughly God had upended their lonely lives through a simple mistake with marriage papers. The fire crackled peacefully, throwing warm light across the cabin they now truly shared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more storms, more threats to their land, the looming meeting with the judge. But tonight, in this moment, they were exactly where they needed to be. Miriam began humming one of her hymns, and after a moment, Gideon's deeper voice joined in, still stumbling over the German words, but trying all the same. Their voices twined together, filling the cabin with a gentle harmony that seemed to say, "This is home, this is right, this is love," growing slow and steady as a mountain spring. The morning dawned, crisp and clear. The recent storm's fury gentled into pristine drifts that sparkled under a bright January Sunday. Gideon and Miriam prepared for their journey down to Bitter Creek, loading the wagon with empty grain sacks and lists of needed supplies. The past weeks of snowbound intimacy had changed something between them, though neither spoke of it directly. "Road should be passable now," Gideon said, checking the horses' harnesses one final time. "But we'll need to take it slow." Miriam nodded, tucking an extra quilt around her skirts as she settled onto the wagon seat. Her heart fluttered with nervous energy. This would be their first appearance in town as a married couple, even if that marriage still balanced on uncertain ground. The descent from their mountain sanctuary took most of the morning. Gideon guided the team carefully around patches of ice and through deep snow. Miriam found herself studying his profile as he concentrated on the trail. The strong line of his jaw, the scars that marked his face, the quiet competence in his hands as he handled the reins. When Bitter Creek's scattered buildings came into view, Miriam sat straighter, squaring her shoulders. She could already imagine the stares and whispers that would greet them. "The Lord gives strength to those who ask," she murmured, more to herself than to Gideon. "Ain't asking the Lord," Gideon replied gruffly. "But I reckon between the two of us, we can handle whatever's coming." The town's main street was churned to brown slush, wagon wheels and boot prints breaking up the pristine snow. As they pulled up in front of the mercantile, heads turned and conversations stopped. Miriam felt the weight of every stare, heard the buzz of whispered comments behind raised hands. "Look who's come down the mountain. That odd pair that got tricked into marriage. Heard it wasn't even a real preacher." Gideon helped Miriam down from the wagon, his hand steady at her elbow. She straightened her plain dress and adjusted her bonnet, determined to show no shame. They were honest people doing honest business. Let the gossips talk. Inside the mercantile, the pot-bellied stove threw welcome heat. Miriam began checking items off their list while Gideon arranged for grain and feed. The shopkeeper's wife watched them with poorly concealed curiosity, but at least she was polite as she measured out sugar and coffee. The bell above the door jangled, and Barstow strode in, followed by two of his men. The railroad agent's expensive coat and polished boots seemed to mock the simple frontier store, his sharp eyes fixed on Gideon and Miriam with predatory interest. "Well, well," he drawled, pulling papers from his inner pocket. "The mountain hermit and his convenient bride. Just the people I've been waiting to see." Miriam felt Gideon tense beside her. She laid a gentle hand on his arm, sensing his anger rising. "I have here," Barstow continued, waving the documents, "proof that your claimed water rights are void. The railroad survey predates any homestead marks." His thin lips curved in a cruel smile as he looked Miriam up and down. "Though, I must say, Hale, I understand why you'd marry a cow for false papers. Desperate times call for desperate measures." The store went deadly quiet. Miriam felt the sting of his words like a physical blow, but something else rose in her. Not shame, but righteous anger. Before Gideon could move, she stepped forward, her voice clear and steady in the tense silence. "You mock what you don't understand, Mr. Barstow," she said. "These hands may not be delicate, but they bake bread that feeds my husband. They sew clothes that keep him warm. They help build a true home where there was only shelter." She held up her work, roughened hands. "That is worth more than any paper you wave about." Someone in the crowded store murmured agreement. Miriam saw several women nodding, and even some of the men looked thoughtful. She continued, her voice gathering strength. "I may not be what you consider fine or fashionable, but I know my worth. It lies not in land claims or railroad schemes, but in honest work and faithful heart. And if you cannot see the value in that, then I pity you." Barstow's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, the shopkeeper spoke up. "Reckon she's got the right of it. We could use more folks speaking plain truth around here." Other voices joined in, showing support. Barstow glanced around, sensing the mood shifting against him. With a final glare, he stuffed his papers away and stalked out, his men following. Gideon stood still, staring at Miriam as if seeing her anew. She felt her cheeks flush under his gaze but held herself proud. The store gradually returned to normal business, but there was a different tone to the glances now. Respect rather than mockery. They finished their shopping and loaded the wagon as afternoon shadows lengthened. The winter day was already fading when Gideon suggested they take a room at the inn rather than risk the mountain trail in darkness. The inn was small but clean, with a dining room that smelled of beef stew and fresh bread. After their meal, they retired to their room. The first time they'd shared such close quarters away from their cabin. The situation might have been awkward, but something had shifted between them during Miriam's confrontation with Barstow. Miriam knelt beside the narrow bed, her nightly prayers coming easily despite the strange surroundings. "Lord, grant us courage for whatever lies ahead. Thank you for giving strength when needed, and for showing that truth spoken plain can overcome cruel words." Gideon sat in the room's single chair, watching her. The lamplight caught the silver threading through her hair, and he marveled at how this woman had transformed his life. Her courage today had stirred something deep in him. Pride, yes, but also a fierce tenderness he'd thought himself incapable of feeling. "You showed real fire today," he said quietly when she finished praying. "Reminded me of a sunrise breaking over the mountains, all light and power." Miriam smiled at the comparison, touching her hot cheeks. "I surprised myself," she admitted. "But I couldn't bear him speaking so, trying to make our life seem false." "Nothing false about you," Gideon said firmly. "Never has been." They settled in for the night, Gideon making a bedroll on the floor despite Miriam's protests about his back. As the lamp burned low, Miriam lay awake, thinking about the day's events. She'd stood up not just for herself, but for the life they were building together. Whatever came next, with Barstow, with the judge, with their future, she knew they would face it side by side. The sound of Gideon's steady breathing below her was comforting, familiar now, after their weeks together. She drifted off to sleep with a prayer of thanksgiving in her heart, grateful for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place, this man, this life that grew more precious with each passing day. The journey back to the mountain took them past Henry's winter camp, nestled in a protected hollow, where tall pines broke the worst of the wind. Smoke rose thin and blue against the crisp morning sky. Gideon guided their wagon off the main trail, following tracks only he could see through the snow. Henry stood waiting as they approached, his dark eyes taking in their loaded wagon and tired faces. He raised a hand in greeting, then gestured toward his fire where a pot of coffee simmered on hot stones. "Share warmth," he said simply, already reaching for extra cups. Miriam climbed down carefully, her boots crunching in the crusty snow. The coffee's rich aroma drew her forward, and she accepted a steaming cup with grateful hands. Gideon settled beside her on a log, their shoulders nearly touching. Henry studied them both before speaking. "Town brings trouble?" "Barstow," Gideon growled. "Railroad man's getting bold." Henry nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "Many riders through here past days, not settlers. Men with guns, watching trails." He traced lines in the snow with a stick, marking paths. "They camp here, here. Watch who comes, who goes." Miriam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Hired men?" "Railroad pays well," Henry confirmed. "They push settlers from good land, good water. Make it look like accidents sometimes." His eyes met Gideon's. "Your spring worth much to them." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Let them try taking it." "Brother," Henry said quietly, using the term from their scouting days. "They will try. Need more than strong arm now. Need paper law. Need voices to speak truth." Miriam set her cup down carefully. "You mean witnesses? People who know the land? The claims?" Henry nodded, approvingly at her understanding. "Old Jim Walker trapped that valley before Gideon. He knows markers, knows rights. Lives down Sweetwater way now." He looked at Gideon. "Others too. Men who worked boundaries when claims first marked." "The circuit judge comes soon," Miriam said. "If we could gather them. And keep those papers safe," Henry added. "Railroad men, they take things. Papers burn easy." Gideon stood, pacing a few steps through the snow. "I'll ride to Sweetwater tomorrow, find Jim." He turned to Miriam. "You'll be all right at the cabin?" She straightened her shoulders. "I can manage. But first, we should make copies of the papers. My husband, my first husband, taught me careful writing. If anything happened to the originals." Henry's expression showed approval. "Wise woman," he said simply. Then his face grew serious. "Watch the spring. They know its worth." They finished their coffee, as Henry shared what else he'd observed of the railroad men's movements. When they prepared to leave, he pressed a small packet of dried herbs into Miriam's hands. "For tea," he explained. "Helps sleep come easier in troubled times." The rest of their journey home passed in thoughtful silence. Miriam watched Gideon's broad back as he handled the reins, seeing the tension in his shoulders. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but something held her back. The same hesitation she'd begun to notice in him. At the cabin, they unloaded quickly, both aware of exposed positions and watching eyes. Gideon immediately set to work checking and reinforcing the shutters while Miriam stored their supplies. The comfortable routine they'd established felt different now, shadowed by Henry's warnings. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Miriam spread the precious papers carefully on the table. She worked by lamplight, copying every detail in her neat hand while Gideon moved restlessly around the cabin, checking locks and sightlines. "My Johannes was particular about his records," she said softly, dipping her pen. "Said a man's word should be backed by careful writing." The memory brought a sad smile. "I never thought his attention to detail would matter so much now." Gideon paused in his pacing to watch her work. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the subtle movements of her hand as she formed each letter. Something stirred in his chest, an ache of longing mixed with the weight of unworthiness. Miriam felt his gaze and glanced up. Their eyes met briefly before Gideon looked away, moving to check the door latch again. She pressed her lips together, forcing down a sigh, and returned to her copying. Later, when the papers were safely stored and the cabin sealed against the night, Miriam settled into her rocking chair by the fire. The gentle creaking of the runners soothed her, though her mind still churned with worries. She drew out her worn Bible, finding comfort in familiar verses. Gideon sat nearby, methodically cleaning his rifle. The firelight played across his scarred face, casting shadows that seemed to deepen his frown of concentration. His hands moved with practiced care over the weapon, but Miriam noticed how his attention kept straying to the windows, the door, the dark corners. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a spray of sparks. Miriam shifted in her chair, and her hand slipped from the Bible to rest on the chair's arm. For a moment, Gideon's own hand moved, reaching toward hers, and her heart leaped. But then he pulled back, returning to his task with forced focus. Miriam's fingers curled inward, empty. She knew what held him back, had seen it in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. The scars that marked his face were nothing compared to the ones he carried inside, the ones that whispered he wasn't worthy of gentler things. "I should check the spring before full dark," Gideon said abruptly, standing. He moved to the door, shrugging into his heavy coat. "Be careful," Miriam said softly. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him that his scars were part of who he was, that they didn't make him less in her eyes. But the words stuck in her throat as he nodded and slipped out into the gathering night. Alone by the fire, Miriam rocked slowly, her thoughts drifting. The wedding band on her finger caught the firelight, a simple circle that had come to mean so much more than the accident of its placing. They worked well together, she and Gideon. They'd built something real from that strange beginning, a partnership, a home. But would it ever be more? She thought of how he protected her, provided for her, respected her. But she also saw how he held himself apart, as if afraid to claim the deeper possibilities of their marriage, as if he believed she deserved better than a scarred mountain man with a troubled past. "Oh Lord," she whispered, "give us both courage, not just for the fight ahead, but for the fears within." The fire crackled softly in response, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate. Miriam kept rocking, waiting for Gideon's return, while outside the winter wind whispered secrets to the waiting dark. When Gideon came back, his boots crusted with snow, he found her still rocking, her eyes distant with thought. He moved quietly around the cabin, securing things for the night, stealing glances at her peaceful face. His hand ached with the memory of almost reaching for hers, and his heart ached with the certainty that she deserved far better than his scarred touch. The first gray light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Miriam stood at the cabin window, kneading bread dough while watching frost patterns fade from the glass. The quiet morning seemed peaceful enough, but something in the air felt wrong. Even the chickens were unusually still in their coop. Gideon had gone to check the trap lines before sunrise. He'd been doing that more often lately, leaving earlier, returning later, keeping watch over their small homestead. The strain of waiting for trouble showed in the tight lines around his eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle. The thunder of hoofbeats shattered the morning silence. Miriam's hands stilled in the dough as 4 riders emerged from the tree line. Her heart sank as she recognized Barstow's sleek coat and sneering face. 3 rough-looking men flanked him, rifles clearly visible across their saddles. "Gideon!" she called out, knowing he couldn't be far. The sound of splitting wood from behind the cabin confirmed he was nearby. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. Barstow's horse pawed at the snow, sending up small clouds of white. "Come out, Hale!" he shouted. "Time to settle this business." Gideon appeared from around the corner, axe still in hand. His eyes narrowed as he took in the armed men. "Nothing to settle," he said, voice hard. "This is my land." Miriam moved to the doorway, wiping flour from her hands. She watched as Barstow dismounted, pulling papers from his coat with exaggerated care. "The railroad's offer is more than fair," Barstow said, holding out the documents. "Sign now. You'll get enough to start fresh somewhere else. Refuse." He gestured to his companions, who had spread out in a loose half-circle. "I told you before," Gideon growled. "This spring, this land, they're not for sale." Barstow's face hardened. "Don't be a fool, Hale. You really think you can hold out against the railroad? Against progress?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Against men who know how to deal with stubborn homesteaders? I think you'd best leave," Gideon said, dropping the axe and letting his hand drift toward the rifle slung across his back. One of Barstow's men moved suddenly, crossing behind Gideon. Before anyone could react, The butt of his rifle crashed into the back of Gideon's head with a sickening thud. "No!" Miriam's scream pierced the morning as Gideon crumpled to his knees. Blood began trickling down his neck, staining the snow beneath him. The man raised his rifle for another blow, but Gideon rolled, catching his attacker's legs. Both men went down in the snow. The other thugs moved forward, boots crunching in the frozen crust. Miriam ran. From the doorway, her heart pounding. "Stop it! Stop this!" She reached Gideon just as one of the men landed a brutal kick to his ribs. Barstow watched with cold satisfaction. "Teach him a lesson, boys. But remember, nothing fatal. We need him able to sign." Gideon struggled to his feet, blood streaming down his face. He managed to block another blow, but his movements were sluggish. Miriam grabbed his arm, trying to steady him. "Get back inside!" Gideon gasped, pushing her away. But Miriam held firm, placing herself between him and the attackers. "You're nothing but cowards," she shouted at Barstow. "4 armed men against one. Is this how your railroad does business?" Something flickered in Barstow's eyes. Perhaps shame, quickly masked. He opened his mouth to respond when one of his men gave a whoop of triumph. "That'll show 'em." Smoke began rising from behind the cabin, where Gideon's storage shed stood. The thug who'd set it waved a torch, grinning. "Might want to take care of that before it spreads." Flames licked up the wooden walls of the shed, where Gideon kept his furs, tools, and winter supplies. The dry wood caught quickly in the cold air. "Consider it a warning," Barstow said, mounting his horse. "Next time won't be so gentle." He nodded to his men, who backed away, laughing. Miriam barely noticed their departure. Gideon had collapsed against her, coughing blood onto the pristine snow. The shed fire crackled ominously behind them. "The spring," Gideon wheezed. "Get buckets. Can't let it spread." For the next frantic hour, they fought the fire together. Miriam ran back and forth from the spring with heavy buckets, while Gideon, despite his injuries, threw snow onto the flames. The shed was lost, but they managed to keep the fire from reaching the cabin or the surrounding trees. When the last flames sputtered out, leaving only smoking ruins, Miriam finally turned her full attention to Gideon. His face was a mess of blood and bruises, and he held himself stiffly, protecting his ribs. "Inside," she ordered, supporting him as he staggered to the cabin. "Let me tend those wounds." He tried to resist, muttering about checking the damage, but she wouldn't hear of it. She settled him by the hearth, building up the fire while gathering her healing supplies. Clean cloths, Henry's herbs, needle and thread just in case. The head wound was ugly, but not as deep as she'd feared. Still, Gideon's eyes were unfocused, and his breathing ragged. As she cleaned away the blood and applied poultices, his hands clenched into fists. "Should have killed them," he muttered, staring into the fire. "Should have been ready. Should have." "Hush," Miriam said firmly, pressing a cold compress to the swelling around his eye. "More violence won't solve this." "No?" Gideon's laugh was bitter. "Seems like violence is all they understand. You saw what they did, what they'll do again." He tried to sit up straighter and winced. "Next time I'll be ready. Next time they won't walk away. If you kill them, you'll hang." Miriam's voice shook. "The railroad will make sure of it. Then what becomes of the land?" "Of..." She hesitated. "Of us?" Gideon turned away, but not before she saw the torment in his eyes. Better to hang than watch them destroy everything. Better to die fighting than live a coward. Miriam grabbed his hand, forcing him to look at her. "There's nothing cowardly about choosing a better way. Violence begets violence. You know this. You've seen where that path leads." His fingers tightened around hers, and she saw the old shadows of his war days crossing his face. "They'll come back," he said hoarsely. "They'll keep coming until they win, or until we stop them legally," Miriam insisted. "With witnesses, with proper papers. That's why they're pushing now. They're scared we have a real claim." She pressed his hand between both of hers. "If you turn to killing, you'll lose more than land or water rights. You'll lose your soul." Gideon pulled his hand free and turned away, but not before she saw the conflict raging behind his eyes. He said nothing more, just stared into the flames as if seeking answers in their dance. Miriam finished tending his wounds in silence. She made him drink willow bark tea for the pain, added more wood to the fire, and tucked a blanket around his shoulders. Through it all, he remained still, lost in dark thoughts. As evening settled over the cabin, she moved quietly around their home, preparing a simple supper neither of them would really eat. The smell of smoke still clung to everything, a bitter reminder of the morning's violence. Outside, snow began falling again, covering the bloodstains and the blackened ruins of the shed. Miriam paused in her work to watch Gideon's face in the firelight. The bruises were darkening, and his breathing still hitched with pain, but it was the spiritual wound she feared most, the way this attack had awakened his old demons, the ones that whispered that violence was the only answer. She sank into her rocking chair and pulled out her worn Bible, letting it fall open to the Psalms. As she read quietly, she prayed that God would give them both strength for the days ahead, strength to fight this battle with wisdom rather than weapons, with faith rather than fury. Gideon shifted restlessly by the fire, caught between pain and anger, between his need for vengeance and Miriam's plea for his soul. The night deepened around them, full of unspoken words and unsettled hearts. January's grip tightened on the mountain, bringing bitter winds that rattled the cabin's shutters. Inside, Miriam tended to Gideon's wounds with gentle determination. The bruises had faded from purple to sickly yellow, but his ribs still ached when he moved too quickly. Each evening, she changed his bandages by lamplight, her hands steady and sure. "You don't have to fuss so," Gideon muttered one night, though he didn't pull away from her touch. "Hush now," Miriam said, carefully applying a fresh poultice. "Let me do what needs doing." In the quiet hours after sunset, when pain kept him from sleep, Miriam would sit in her rocking chair and sing. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying hymns in German that seemed to fill every corner of the cabin. Though Gideon couldn't understand the words, something in the melody soothed the restless anger that still burned in his chest. One morning, as pale winter sunlight streamed through the window, Miriam spread their documents across the rough-hewn table. "We must go to court," she said firmly. "The circuit judge will be in Bitter Creek soon." Gideon stood at the window, watching snow swirl outside. "It's too dangerous. Barstow's men will be waiting." "And if we don't go?" Miriam challenged. "They'll take everything. The spring, the land, your home." She shuffled through the papers, her movements precise. "We have proof here. My husband's water rights. Witness statements from Henry about your years working this claim. God didn't bring these papers to light for us to hide them away in fear." Gideon turned to face her, his expression troubled. "You truly believe that? That God had a hand in this?" "I do." Miriam met his gaze steadily. "I believe he brought me here for a purpose, though it started with a mistake and confusion. Nothing is wasted in his plan, Gideon. Not even our trials." The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Gideon studied Miriam's face, the quiet certainty in her eyes, the strength beneath her gentle manner. Finally, his shoulders dropped with a heavy sigh. "We'll need Henry," he said. "I won't risk the journey without someone watching our backs." Miriam's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I'll pack provisions while you send word to him." The next few days were filled with preparation. Miriam dried extra bread, packed dried meat and beans, and mended their warmest clothes. Gideon cleaned his rifle and checked the wagons, though every movement still brought a grimace of pain. Henry arrived on the fourth morning, materializing from the swirling snow like a ghost. He carried news that made Gideon's face darken. Barstow's men had been seen watching the trail to town. "We take the high pass," Henry said, helping them load the wagon. "Longer route, but harder to follow." They set out at first light the next day. The wagon creaked through deep snow, while Henry rode ahead and Gideon brought up the rear. Miriam sat wrapped in blankets, clutching their precious documents close. The first day's travel was slow and grueling. The horses struggled in the drifts, and the wind cut through their clothes like knives. By late afternoon, Henry called a halt in a sheltered hollow. Too dangerous to push on in darkness, he said, helping them set up canvas for the night. They huddled around a small fire, sharing coffee and hard bread. Henry took first watch, leaving Gideon and Miriam alone beneath the canvas shelter. The wind moaned through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled. Miriam noticed Gideon staring into the flames, his face haunted by more than just physical pain. She moved closer, offering warmth and comfort without words. "I never told you," he said suddenly, his voice rough, "about how I got these scars." Miriam reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Tell me now." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like ice breaking in spring thaw. He spoke of a territorial skirmish years ago, when he'd served as a scout alongside Henry. A mission gone wrong, an ambush in a narrow canyon. The flash of gunfire, the screams of dying men, the copper taste of blood in his mouth. "I killed 3 men that day," he said, his hand trembling in hers. "Up close, with a knife when the bullets ran out. I can still feel." He broke off, shuddering. That wasn't the worst, though. He touched the scar that ran from temple to jaw. This came later, trying to stop the killing, trying to stand between angry men and innocent families. "Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm still there, covered in blood that won't wash away." Miriam listened without flinching, her grip on his hand steady. When he fell silent, the weight of memory heavy between them, she reached up to trace the scar with gentle fingers. "The blood is long gone," she said softly, "though the memories remain. But those memories show a man who chose mercy, who tried to stop violence rather than add to it. Like you're choosing now, by taking the legal path instead of revenge." Gideon's voice was barely a whisper. "And still you stay, knowing what these hands have done." Miriam's answer came without hesitation, firm as bedrock. "And always will." She pulled their joined hands to her heart, letting him feel its steady beat. "The past is past, Gideon. God offers new mornings, new mercies. What matters is the path we choose today." Tears gleamed in the firelight, falling silently down Gideon's scarred cheek. Miriam reached up to brush them away, then began to sing softly, an old Amish hymn of comfort and peace. The German words floated into the night, weaving around them like a blanket of grace. Henry's quiet footsteps approached, signaling time to change watch. But for that moment, in the circle of firelight beneath the stars, something profound had shifted between Gideon and Miriam. The walls around his heart, built so carefully over years of solitude, had finally begun to crumble. They settled down to sleep, closer than before, sharing warmth against the bitter cold. The wind continued to moan through the pines, but its voice seemed less lonely now. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, dangerous trails, the threat of ambush, the looming confrontation in town. But they would face it together, their bond stronger for having been tested by truth. Bitter Creek hunched beneath a steel-gray sky as Gideon, Miriam, and Henry guided their wagon down the last snowy slope. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, painting the town's weathered buildings in long shadows. Smoke curled from chimneys, and lamplight glowed in frosted windows. "Railroad men everywhere," Henry muttered, noting the well-dressed strangers lounging on the hotel porch. Miriam clutched their document case closer as they passed the saloon. Through its swinging doors came raucous laughter and the clink of glasses. Several men in expensive coats stood at the bar, Barstow's distinctive figure among them. The innkeeper's wife, Martha Reynolds, hurried out to meet them as they pulled up to the modest boarding house. "Come in quickly," she whispered, her kind face creased with worry. "I've kept 2 rooms ready, just as Henry arranged." Inside, the house was warm and smelled of fresh bread. Martha's 2 young daughters helped carry in Miriam's bags, while her husband Thomas stabled the horses. The family had always been friendly to Gideon on his trading visits, and they welcomed Miriam like a long-lost sister. "The circuit judge arrives tomorrow morning," Martha told them over a simple supper of stew and biscuits. "Half the town's talking about your case." Later that evening, while Miriam settled in upstairs, Gideon stepped out onto the back porch for air. Voices drifted from the alley behind the saloon, Barstow and another man speaking in low tones. Judge Carlton likes his comforts, Barstow was saying. 500 in gold should ensure he sees things our way. And if he doesn't? Then we have other methods. But he has never refused railroad money before. Gideon's hands clenched into fists. He wanted nothing more than to confront them, to end this with violence. But Miriam's words echoed in his mind, about losing more than land if he chose that path. He found Miriam in her room, kneeling beside the bed in prayer. She looked up as he entered, reading the tension in his face. "What troubles you?" she asked softly. "Barstow plans to bribe the judge." Gideon growled. 500 in gold. Miriam's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "Then we must pray harder. God's justice is stronger than man's greed." She patted the floor beside her. Gideon hesitated, years of doubt and anger warring with his need for peace. Finally, slowly, he lowered himself to his knees beside her. Miriam's prayer was simple but fierce, her German-accented words carrying conviction. "Lord, guide the judge's heart toward truth. Let justice flow like water. Protect us from those who would harm your children." Gideon didn't speak, but his head remained bowed long after she finished. Morning brought bitter cold, and a sky heavy with snow. By 9 o'clock, the courthouse was packed. Farmers, merchants, and railroad men pressed shoulder to shoulder in the small space. Henry stood at the back, watchful, while Martha and her family sat supportively behind Gideon and Miriam. Judge Carlton arrived precisely at 9:30, a tall man with iron-gray hair and piercing eyes. He surveyed the crowded room as he took his seat, his expression giving nothing away. Barstow presented his case first, laying out railroad documents with flourish. "The company's claim to these water rights is clear," he announced. "We have surveys, territorial grants, and development plans that will bring prosperity to this entire region." The judge examined each paper carefully, while Miriam gripped Gideon's hand beneath the table. When Barstow finished, Judge Carlton looked up. And the opposition? Miriam stood, her legs trembling but her voice clear. "Your Honor, I have documents showing prior claim to these waters." She stepped forward, presenting her late husband's papers. "These rights were legally registered 5 years ago. The spring in question feeds both properties, my previous husband's claim and Gideon Hale's homestead." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Barstow's face darkened. "The water rights were never abandoned," Miriam continued. "They transferred to me upon my husband's death, and now through marriage to Gideon Hale, creating an unbroken line of claim." Gideon rose to stand beside her. "I've worked that land for 10 years, Your Honor. The spring is vital to both properties. We can prove continuous use and development." The judge studied their documents intently while the room held its breath. Snow began falling outside the windows, adding to the heavy silence. Barstow stepped forward, his lips curled in a sneer. "Your Honor, look at this woman, an Amish outcast who can barely read English. How can we trust her papers? She's clearly manipulated this situation, using her substantial presence to trap a simple mountain man." The courtroom grew deadly quiet. Miriam's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin and met the judge's eyes. "God does not waste lives, and he did not waste mine," she declared, her voice steady and clear. Judge Carlton thumbed through both sets of documents once more, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he straightened in his chair. "The law is clear. Prior claim stands. The spring and associated water rights belong to the Hale homestead, secured through Mrs. Hale's previous claim. This court so rules." Before the crowd's surprised murmurs could grow, Gideon rose to his feet. "Your Honor, one more thing." He turned to face Miriam. "I ask you to record that I choose this woman as my wife. Not by accident, but by my own free will." Miriam's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Around them, the townspeople stood, respect evident in their faces as the judge solemnly recorded Gideon's declaration. The mountain air carried the sweet scent of melting snow and new growth as Gideon and Miriam made their way back to their cabin. Where winter's grip had held tight just weeks before, green shoots now pushed through softening earth. Gideon wasted no time. Each morning, he worked steadily, laying foundation stones for their new home near the precious spring. The sound of his hammer rang through the clearing as sturdy walls rose, topped by a wide porch meant for summer evenings. "For our family," he said simply, when Miriam asked about the extra rooms. She placed a rocking chair on the fresh-built porch, the one he'd carved for her at Christmas. Her clear voice lifted in hymns while she watched him work, her fingers busy with mending. Henry rode up one afternoon, bringing a woven blanket as a gift. They shared venison stew and fresh bread around the table, their laughter easy and warm. As the sun painted the mountains gold and purple, Gideon drew Miriam close against his side. "I'll never let you go," he whispered roughly. "Not now, not ever." Miriam nestled into his embrace, peace settling deep in her heart. What had seemed a terrible mistake now stood revealed as God's own plan, as clear as the spring that had brought them together. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.